yesterday was a packed day, and today will also be a packed day. But it's actually great that we are starting with Professor Rajiv Sethi from Bharat College, Columbia University. He's going to be talking about the economics of group inequality. I'm particularly pleased to have him. I've heard him talk many times, and he will definitely wake you up with the kind of things that he will be presenting. So thanks, Rajiv, for coming in. That's good.
Okay, good. So let me know if you need me to talk louder or softer. Thank you, first of all, Arjun, and all the other folks who put this together. It's a very exciting prospect, I think, and I hope you all are getting a lot out of it. I had the chance to meet some of you at dinner last night, and I hope I'll meet the others at some point today. Just feel free. I'm available all day today, although we'll be leaving town tomorrow. So I look forward to meeting those whom I haven't yet met. So I'll be talking about the economics of group inequality, and my lecture today will be based on a course that I've been teaching for the last couple of years at the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia. And it's a 14-week course, 2 hours a week, so it's going to be a bit compressed. but I want to give you an overview of what the discussion we have in this class is about, and then go through a couple of more detailed topics of analysis, and then leave it open for you guys to ask questions. And please interrupt me at any time. I know you're not shy about speaking. or maybe that was just after a couple of glasses of wine last week. but anyway, just interrupt me.
Demanding a bit at 9 in the morning. But
exactly. 9 in the morning you might be a bit more reticent, but feel free to interrupt.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to start by talking about what group inequality really is. To talk about the meaning and the dimensions of group inequality. There was some discussion last night by Professor Patnaik about identity politics, and we contrasted it with true democracy or more authentic democracy, and there's some question about whether or not one can actually escape identity politics. Whether identity, our attachment to identities, both for ourselves and for others, are something that's very hard for us to shake. What my talk today is going to do is to basically take those identities as given exogenously. I'm not going to ask why identities form, why particular identities at particular times and places are salient. We're going to look at the consequences really of the fact that identities exist, and people put each other into bins, by race, by ethnicity, by religion, gender, sexual orientation, whatever it might be. Given that we do that, what are some of the consequences of that? That's really what we mean by group inequality, and I'll be taking an economic approach to this question. Why should we care about it? I'll spend a little bit of time on that, as opposed to inequality more generally, because you've probably discussed inequality without bringing identity into the picture. And the question is, well, what extra needs to be attended to when we consider identity? I give some empirical evidence on the extent of group inequality, especially with regard to racial inequality in the United States. And a lot of my work is motivated by the United States experience, but the work is theoretical, so it applies to basically any society, because any society you can think of, with very, very few exceptions, is subject to cleavages along lines of identity. You can think about race, ethnicity, religion, linguistic preference, for example. So even denominations, even the division between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, Anglophones and Francophones in Quebec, in Canada, and so on. So you get these kind of cleavages everywhere. But my examples will be from the United States. That's the society that I know best. Then we'll talk about mechanisms that sustain group inequality over time, inequality between identity groups. And there are really two that are really dominant in the literature. One is segregation and the other is stereotypes. Now, I won't have time to talk much about stereotypes, which is a huge, big topic in its own right. But I'll spend quite a bit of time today talking about segregation. And so we talk about the emergence and persistence of group inequality. So I said that we're going to take group inequality or identity as given and look at some of the consequences of this fact. But we also will go back a bit and try to think a little bit at the end about how these identities might emerge to begin with. Right? And, even if there's no historical group inequality, how might we get group inequality coming out of an initially group egalitarian situation? That's a question that I find interesting and would like to talk about. Now that's quite ambitious, so we may not cover everything, but that's the agenda. Okay. So one way to define group inequality is as a correlation between identity and some attributes or economic attributes. So in a technologically modern society, you're going to have some occupations. So let's think about occupational inequality. You're going to have some occupations. Think about heart surgeons, for example. Think about legal professions. These are occupations that require years of expensive and difficult investments. And they're going to be compensated, even in market equilibrium. And, if people enter these occupations, put in a lot of time and effort and expense, they're going to expect to be compensated in some way. It need not be monetary compensation, but monetary plus non-monetary compensation has to be sufficient to induce people to enter these professions. And then you're going to have other professions that require lower levels of investment. And so you'll have, in any technologically modern society, you're going to have an occupational hierarchy. There are people who will be doing less skilled things, and there are people who will be doing highly skilled things, and there's going to be a whole range in between. And so you're going to get that kind of inequality. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have group inequality. Because if you have identity groups in a society, think about gender, for instance, or think about religion, there's no reason why people of a particular religion or particular gender should be concentrated at different points in this occupational hierarchy. You could have an even spread of people. Right? So with regard to gender, with regard to race, with regard to ethnicity, they could be spread evenly across the occupational hierarchy. And then you'll have inequality. There may be a lot of inequality. But you would not have group inequality. What we mean by group inequality is a correlation between identity and one's position in this occupational hierarchy. Just to take one example. Right? So if people who belong to a particular, if males or whites or whatever it might be are concentrated in a particular segment of this occupational hierarchy and others are concentrated elsewhere, then we say we have group inequality. Right? So group inequality refers to correlations rather than dispersions. Right? And it has lots of dimensions. So we think about income and wealth inequalities very commonly in economics. And of course also inequalities with regard to health, life expectancy, inequalities with regard to educational attainment, but occupational status, which I have just mentioned. You can talk about inequality with regard to neighborhood quality. So, how clean is one's neighborhood? How well served is it by public investments? Or we can also talk about inequality with regard to peer groups. What are the characteristics of the people who surround us? That's another aspect of inequality. So two people could have the same income, same life expectancy, but they could have very different people surrounding them. That's an aspect of inequality we don't think about too much. But it's an important aspect, I want to argue. There's inequality with regard to collective reputation, so this is stereotype. So if particular groups holding constant their individual characteristics, if they are believed to have certain characteristics, because those individual characteristics are not observable, so they are stereotyped or profiled. If they're thought to be, let's say, unusually violent, or they're thought to be not law-abiding, because that's a reputation that the group to which they belong has associated with it, even individuals who don't fit that stereotype will be treated in certain ways. And that's a kind of inequality too. Right? That's something to keep in mind. Crime victimization is another aspect of group inequality. If members of particular groups are more likely to be subject to particular types of crimes, that's one aspect. Offending, arrest, so participation in criminal activities is another form. Arrest and incarceration is another. These are big issues in the United States. And then an aspect of group inequality that I personally find very interesting is belief inequality. So the most obvious example is religion. People who have different religions have belief inequality. They believe different things. And they agree to disagree about those beliefs. Right? They don't convert each other, at least not routinely.
They don't agree to disagree.
Right, they just disagree. Yes. They agree to disagree in the sense that they're not persuaded by the disagreement to change their minds. Right? That's what I mean. But you can also have belief heterogeneity along other lines. Beliefs about how just is the system under which we live. Beliefs about innate characteristics or deep cultural characteristics of particular individuals or particular groups. Right? People may have disagreement along these lines. These are all aspects of group inequality. They're all completely fascinating. They all deserve a lecture in their own right. So we're going to just selectively discuss some of these things. Why should we care about group inequality? So there's a wonderful essay by Glenn Lowry, who's been thinking about these things for 30 odd years now. There's a book, his Du Bois lectures at Harvard were published in a book in 2002, and prior to that he's got essays and lectures on this thing. And he asked the question, well, why should we care about group inequality, right? So if you think about a society in which you've got people, who value leisure and relaxation more than they value money. And they decide that they would prefer to put in fewer hours at work and spend more time on other kinds of activities, hobbies, travel, whatever it may be. And then there are others who really don't care for these things and really get much more of their satisfaction from work and decide that they want to put in more hours or pursue more ambitious career goals. And you have this kind of preference difference. You're going to find members of one group, right? Let's call them the group that values leisure, concentrated in particular occupations, and you're going to find the group that has less of a value for leisure, concentrated on others. this is a kind of group inequality. They could have identities that differ, right? But is it a group inequality that we should care about? Well, not necessarily, right? Because they are freely choosing. You know, members of one group could have chosen a different kind of lifestyle. Their preferences have driven them to one thing rather than another. So Lowry asks a very deep, philosophically deep question. Why should we care? If we see group inequality, should we then, you know, we might be concerned about inequality per se, right? High or low inequality, but why should we care about group inequality, right? If members of different groups are different parts of the distribution, maybe that reflects free and independent choices. And really that's the key question. Are they free and independent choices? Or are there historical conditions that have driven groups to occupy certain positions in the occupational hierarchy or in general to have levels of accomplishment, achievement, and status in society? Okay? So history matters a lot. If there's a history of hierarchy, if there's a history of subordination, and you have group inequality, that matters much more than if you don't have such a history. Right? Although I'm going to qualify that statement today. Let me give you a little bit of data. I think it's always good to look at data, and I know that folks here are from a variety of different backgrounds, some with strong economics training and some with training in other kinds of areas and disciplines. But let me present to you some data that I think should be accessible to everyone. Right? So here's a couple of maps of Manhattan where I live, and this is taken from joint work with Rohini Somanathan, and I'll be mentioning more work with her as we proceed. So the map on the left is the actual Manhattan, right? So what does it show? This is Manhattan divided into what are called census block groups, and a census block group is defined roughly to correspond to the notion of a neighborhood. Okay? And what is shown here are the percentage black divided by relative to the percentage of black plus white. So these are households in Manhattan. We have taken out Latino households who could classify themselves as black or white or neither. We've taken out Asian households, so just black and white households in Manhattan. And each neighborhood has a certain ratio of black to black plus white, right? And that's what's shown over here, and the keys over here. It ranges from 0% to about 100%. And you can see there's a great deal of neighborhood residential segregation, right? So you have areas, the Lower East Side over here, this is Central Park, and north of Central Park you have actually Columbia Universities around here. You have Harlem and Washington Heights, etc. And then you have the Upper East Side, the most affluent parts of Manhattan. This is the West Side and so on. And you get some variability, but you get a great deal of neighborhood segregation. So one could look at this and say, there's a lot of different reasons, a lot of different mechanisms that could give rise to this kind of visual pattern. One that might come to you obviously is to say, oh, maybe there's a lot of income inequality in Manhattan, right? Maybe you have whites are generally more affluent, blacks are less affluent. Maybe people like to live with people who have the same income level, and this is just an accident. It's just a byproduct, not of race-conscious location patterns, but rather of the fact that you have inequality in incomes and people are sorting on income. That's a hypothesis that one could explore empirically. We can reject that hypothesis. We can reject it decisively based on the Manhattan on the right. So what's the Manhattan on the right? That's a hypothetical Manhattan that we created, right? An imagined Manhattan, where in each neighborhood of this imagined Manhattan, neighborhoods are the same in the two, the real, the hypothetical. Right? The neighborhoods are the same. Each neighborhood has the same number of people in the real and the hypothetical Manhattan. Each neighborhood has the same income distribution. So in fact, in the US Census of 2000, this is from the 2000 census, there are 16 different income classes, income categories. Each neighborhood in the hypothetical Manhattan is constrained to have the same income distribution, the same number of people in income category 1, the same number of people in income category 2. So what's the difference, right? So far I haven't told you what the difference is between these two Manhattans. The difference is that within each income category, right, the racial composition in the real Manhattan is whatever it is, whereas in the hypothetical Manhattan, it is constrained to equal the racial composition in that income category for the city as a whole. Okay? So if you have a neighborhood and it has got, let's say, 100 people who are in the poorest income category, and if the city as a whole, in that poorest income category, you have 40% black, 60% white, then that neighborhood, regardless of what that neighborhood looks like in the real Manhattan, we impute in the hypothetical Manhattan that 40 of those 60 will be black, 60 of those 40 will be white. In actuality, there may be 100 black, or there may be 98 white, right? But we impute within each income category. And the reason for doing this is to get a sense of what Manhattan would look like if people sorted only on income, right? If they only sorted on income the way that they actually do, and racial segregation was simply a side effect of that, what would Manhattan look like? It would look completely different. It would be much more integrated. Now, when you look at that and say, oh, Manhattan would be, yeah.
Small question. You said you're going to impute the ratio from the city?
Yes.
The 5 boroughs?
Yes, the 5 boroughs, actually. But that's not, one could impute from Just Manhattan, just the borough
Okay.
of Manhattan, it wouldn't make any difference.
All
Or
right.
you could impute from the metropolitan area, which consists of surrounding counties, including Long Island. It wouldn't make any difference.
Oh, okay.
You could include the broader metropolitan area, including northern New Jersey. It wouldn't make any difference. You still get the same picture. You can do this with different cities. You still get the same picture. Now, you could say, oh, does that mean that there isn't much black-white inequality in income? Right? That could be one reason. Maybe there isn't enough black-white inequality in income to generate this, and that's part of the story. But the bigger part of the story is that you don't have much income segregation in Manhattan. You get rich and poor actually living in the same neighborhood. You've got high-rise apartment buildings, and you've got people living in the basement, and you've got people living in the penthouse, and you've got lots of income mixing. So income segregation can't explain much racial segregation, because there's too much income mixing for that to happen. So something else is going on. People are actually sorting themselves across neighborhoods. And race is salient in that sorting decision. The neighborhood racial character is salient. There's lots of evidence along these lines. This is just one example. Okay, now let's take a different picture. Now this is a picture of a school, a middle school. It's taken from the work of the sociologist James Moody. And this looks at friendship networks. So people in a school are asked, they are asked to write down a list of their friends. So you can list up to, I think, 5 in this study. And so for each individual, there will be connections that they themselves identify. So and so, give a list of their friends, and their friends will also appear in the same data set. Right? So basically, for each, you get a big matrix for each. If you think about, if there were 100 people in the sample, you get a matrix 100 by 100, and in each cell of that matrix, there'll be either a 0 or 1. There'll be a 1 if the row person identifies the column person as a friend. Right? So it's just that's what the data looks like, but it's visualized in a particular way over here. So each individual here is again white, black, or mixed or mixed/other, right? Which are the red dots. And so let me explain a couple of things here first. If you look at this visually, it looks like there are 4 clusters of friendships, right? Visually, it looks like there are 4 clusters of friendships. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2 of them are largely black, 2 of them are largely white. If you took a bird's eye view of the school, so you don't go peering down at the actual friendship networks, and you just look at the school, you would say, wow, that's a really integrated school. That's a school which has got roughly 50% black, 50% white. That's a school in which a lot of people are mixing. You look this way, and you see that there isn't a whole lot of mixing. Right? So there's a lot of, in terms of the friendship networks, the micro relationships, there's a great deal of segregation at the micro level. But can we really reduce that? Now think carefully. I hope some of you have become a little suspicious now. Because I told you that the data is just zeros and ones. Now, if your data is just zeros and ones, this is represented by taking every node, every circle corresponds to an individual, and every line corresponds to a friendship relationship. So you take every node and you draw a line with an arrow. It's a directed graph, so you can see the little arrowheads. An arrow from node I to node J is drawn if I lists J as a friend. Okay, that's the data. But that data, and this is the point that I hope is sort of bugging you a little bit, that data could be represented visually in an infinite number of different ways. I could have just taken my nodes and put them like a chessboard. Person 1, person 2, person 3, right? Completely symmetric grid, and drawn the exact same lines. That would have been a representation of the exact same data. Correct? So why is it drawn in this way, and is it meaningful? That would not show any separation at all. In fact, I could take black, white, black, white, black, white, and put them in that way. And then as long as I keep my lines consistent, right, that would be a visual representation of the exact same friendship network. Correct? So what's special about this representation? Why is it meaningful to us? Why should we think about this as somehow reflecting segregation when we could have visually represented the exact same data in a way that doesn't show any segregation at all? Okay? Let me explain that. This is meaningful. There is a reason why it looks like this, right? But I need to explain it. You should be suspicious about that. You should say, oh, you just arrange these dots and just put all, you just arrange them in such a way that it looks, oh, it's highly segregated. But we could have taken all these things and spread them out and made them all integrated. As long as we preserve the lines, we're representing exactly the same data. It's very important to understand how this picture is generated. Right? It's generated using something called a spring algorithm. And if you ever work with network data, you're going to be using something like this. So what is a spring algorithm? The spring algorithm basically takes 2 individuals who are connected to a line, and it treats that connection, that line, as a spring. And every spring, when you extend a spring, it becomes more tense, right? The tension in the spring increases. And if you put people who are connected far apart in visual space, you're creating tension, more tension in that spring. And what the spring algorithm does is it basically takes the data from the network, right? And it arranges it across space in such a way that it minimizes the aggregate tension in all the springs taken together. Which means that if there are clusters of friendships, right? I'm connected to Arjun, Arjun's connected to Rohini, and so on and so forth. Then, if you all have a cluster of friendships, visually the algorithm will put us close to each other in space. So there is a sociological interpretation that is meaningful of this data. If I had arranged it like a chessboard, black, white, yes, it would have looked very integrated, but the tensions in the springs would have been huge, right? And so it would have been a poor representation of the social clusters. So it's really important to consider what the algorithm is doing. Yeah.
Just a brief question. So if it's a spring algorithm, a couple places you'll see that there's a single node.
Good.
Connection, you have varying.
Very good question. Very good question. So before I answer your question, let's think about what a spring algorithm would do if the only instruction that were given to it is minimize the sum of the tensions in the spring. If that was the only instruction given to the algorithm, what would it do? Everybody would be at the same point. There would be only one dot. All the dots would be exactly at the same point. Then you get zero tension in all the springs, and that's what it would look like. So you have to, in order to create, some spread, you have to give it a constraint, right? That it must occupy a certain area in visual space that could be large or small. Now, once you do that, it has to minimize the sum of the tension and subject to that constraint, and that's what gives you a few people who are. If you've got isolated people, it's good to put them away from the rest because there's no tension. There's no tension in the springs, right? So you're able to fill up the space in such a way that doesn't violate the basic condition. So, I'll take your question in just a moment. But the key point is that this is not a trick to make you think that the school is segregated. Right? The spring algorithm doesn't do anything about segregation or not segregation. It just takes the links, and if you have large numbers of clusters, it puts them close together in space, and we see 4 clusters. So we need to think about why 4 clusters, why not 2, why not 6, 8, 15. We'll do that in just a second, but there was a question.
I was curious to see what the graph would look like if it was restricted to just bidirectional connections, and also is there a way of looking at this where it's weighted by, you probably say your friends 1, 2, 3.
Very good. So these are both these are questions. This data is taken from something called the Adolescent Health Survey, which is a very detailed data set of interactions at this level. Not just about friendships, but about sexual interactions, about conversations, hours spent. So you can rank friendships in terms of acquaintances, loose friends, firm friends, and so on. Plus, you can talk about bidirectional. Okay, how many people are friends? How many folks? There are going to be people who have who list 5 people but are listed by none. Actually, you could have that kind of unfortunate situation. It does arise. It does arise. But what would it look like? You would still, with the bidirectional, you would still see qualitatively the same pattern of segregation that you see over here. Right? With regard to different rankings, then it raises subtle issues which I'm not going to get into right now about exactly how you represent, because then each link is itself a weighted link. They don't have equal. So the tension in some springs would have more weight than the tension in other springs. So you would get a different picture. For this particular data, I'm actually not sure what you would get in that case. I suspect you would get qualitatively a fair degree of segregation, but there may be other differences. Yeah.
So just trying to understand this algorithm, so the tension should be proportional to the distance.
Yes, square. The square of the distance.
Yeah, and so it is basically absolute value of vector summation of all the distances, all the
absolute, the square of the absolute value. So it's just, okay. But yeah, that's correct. That's correct. Yeah. So why 4? Any idea? Why 4? What do these 4 clusters represent? Anyone want to take a guess?
Do they come from 4 neighborhoods?
That's a reasonable conjecture, but that's not what's going on over here.
Girls and boys?
It's not male, female either.
Age?
It's not income background either. These are all very reasonable hypotheses.
Age.
Yes. Say it again?
Age.
Age. So these are actually 2 different grades. I told you it's from a school, but I didn't tell you that they're all in the same grade, same class. So you have 2 different grades. I think maybe 6th and 7th grade or 5th and 6th grade. And so you expect segregation by class, right? You expect people's friends to be in the same age cohort in the same class. So you would expect at least 2 clusters if you've got 2 classes, right? But what you have is basically segregation by age is roughly comparable to segregation by race in this particular school. Right? So that gives you an idea of the order of magnitude people interact across race about as much as they do across class, across age cohort. Okay? That's right, exactly. Okay, so this is the same kind of data. Let me skip this in the interest of time, but it gives you the same kind of picture. So it asks, using the same data set, not the same school, but the same adolescent health survey. So if you're white and you ask, you have 131 in this particular school. If you look here, this particular school is 51% white, 38% black, 5% Latino, Hispanic, and 6% other, right? Which could be Asian, it could be biracial, so on. Okay, or people whose identities are more unusual. So again, if you look at the school, it looks very integrated. Like 40% black, 50% white, it looks very integrated. But if you look at the white friendships, there are 85% of white friendships are white, and the same holds for 85% of black friendships. So the diagonal exceeds. If everybody was forming friendships randomly, you should expect 51 here and 58.
Just a clarification. Here, white means white, non-Hispanic whites?
Correct. White, non-Hispanic whites. Correct.
Similarly, black also, right? Non-Hispanic.
Non-Hispanic, black, non-Hispanic. But Hispanics very rarely self-classify as black. So basically, even though they may be classified by others as black, so basically Hispanic is a ethnicity characteristic in the United States Census, and black-white is a racial category. And so people specify both race and ethnicity. So you can say white Hispanic, black Hispanic, etc., etc. Right? So these cut across the line. So that's non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic black, but non-Hispanic black and Hispanic black, and black are almost identical categories. Hispanics classify themselves about 50% as white and about 50% as other. Okay, this is group size and friendship. So this is a very interesting data set that gives you something that you may not have expected. So here's what it does. So every school now appears 4 times as 4 separate dots in this data set. Let's understand what's going on in this one. So whites are blue dots. So if you take a school over here, right, this school over here is about, let's say, 75% white. Okay, so that the school which is 75% white will be concentrated over here. The dot would be here. Now suppose that school happens to be 25% black. The remaining 25% is black. In that case, black is a red dot. It could be, let's say, around here. Right? So that school would be here and here. Okay, because it's 25% black and 75% white. Right? So each school can appear 4 times in this thing. Now, what this shows is, this just calculates the total number of friends. The number of friends you have as a proportion of how many in your particular school belong to your own particular group. Okay? And so over here, the schools that are over here, the blue dots here, close to 100%, these are schools that are almost entirely white, but you have also got schools here that are almost entirely black. Okay? And then over here you've got schools, lots of schools that have got practically 0% Asian, or 0%, in this case 0% black practically. In this case, the red ones here, here 0% white is a school. Okay? This school could have, let's say, 100% black somewhere around here. All right? So each school can appear 4 times. What this line shows is something that's come to be called a friendship gradient. What that means is that within your own school, if your own school consists of individuals who are within your own social group, within your own identity group, you tend to have more friends. Right? That's not immediately apparent. This is not about segregation. It's just about the total number of linkages that you have as a function of whether or not you have majority status in your school or minority status in your school. So over here, at this end, where the average person has lots of friends, you could have schools that are entirely white or almost entirely black. Okay? And over here, it just basically shows that schools in which you are a minority, individuals who are a small minority in their school have fewer friends than individuals who are a vast, overwhelming majority in their particular school.
Just to clarify real quick, the y-axis is average number of friends per student in the school?
No, correct.
Okay.
Correct. Average number of friends, conditional on the social group. So basically.
Okay, so like average number of friends per white student at the school.
Correct. If we go back to my example over here, suppose that you've got 75% white here, you've got, let's say, 7 friends. Each white person in the school would have 7 friends, whereas you've got, let's say, if the same school is here, each black person in that school would have 4 friends. Right? So that's how to read it. So there's a friendship gradient. You might want to think about this. I mean, there's work that's been done trying to account for this. It's something for you to think about. I won't say any more about it. This talks about something called the popularity achievement rating. So in the US, your academic performance in school is measured on a 4-point GPA scale. Right? An A counts as a 4, a B counts as a 3, etc., etc. Right? So here, this tells you your academic performance, and this tells you your friendships. Again, from the same data set. Right? How many friends do you have? And you get this very, very striking phenomenon where if you're white, as your grades improve, your number of friends goes up. Okay? People who are doing well at school actually are also more popular, conditional on being white. But, and the middle line is black popularity. Black popularity also rises, but at the top end, right? People who are getting B's, let's say, if they start getting A's, they start to lose friends. Okay? Over here, Latinos is even more extreme. So around, basically, this is around a B minus. Right? So the peak is around here, and then you start to lose friends quite dramatically. So people who are getting A's have fewer friends than people who are getting D's. What grade is it? Yeah, so I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I can refer you, this is a paper by Roland Fryer and Torelli, published in 2010, and you can go find out.
That's not how I remember high school.
Yeah, well, you think that the whites in your high school had fewer friends, the high performing, the nerds.
Dorks?
The dogs and nerds were ostracized. It happens. In fact, it happens. It absolutely happens. That's right. Yeah, and there are anecdotal stories. But if you look at the survey data, this is what comes out of it. But definitely, anecdotally, there's definitely stories about ostracism of the nerds and the dogs and the geeks. Who in every school, for every ethnic group, right? It's there. But it appears to be different for different social groups. And this, of course, affects incentives for performing well in school. There are differences across groups in terms of the reward. This is one of the things that
For Indian schools, look like an exponential.
That's something worth thinking about because it means we often think of performance in school as being related to talent and effort, right? But we don't usually think about it as being incentive driven. But here you can see there are certain incentives that are driving performance in certain directions. There was a question.
Just kind of a clarification addition to that. Does the paper have any discussion about the variance in number of friends as it increases in?
I'm not sure if the paper has, but there is a lot of variance, and that's exactly your point as well. That you didn't experience quite what the average performance indicates with regard to this graph. But yes, so there's plenty of variance. But these are the averages. But even the averages are going to have incentive effects. That's one of them. Okay, let's talk about homicide victimization. So I'm giving you an overview of the topics that I deal with in my course, and then we'll, depending on how much time we have, we'll go through some of the theoretical understanding of these things. And I can point you to literature that speaks to each of these things separately. Here's homicide victimization. So this is the likelihood of being killed. The likelihood of being killed, conditional on race and gender in the United States from 1950 to 2004, separately for men and women. And you can see that per 100,000 population, so out of every 100,000 black males, 47 were killed in any particular year. Right? That's the homicide victimization rate. Whereas for whites in 1950 it was less than 4. So there's about, the ratio is here. There's a 12-to-1 ratio of the likelihood of being a homicide victim. And that's sort of mitigated a bit, so that you still have about 6 to 7, closer to 7, even in the more recent data. Even though homicide rates have gone down, they've gone down for both whites and blacks, but the ratio, there's still big disparity in terms of homicide victimization rates. Now, the reason why that's worth paying some attention to is because this 6-to-1 ratio is far greater than any disparity in poverty rates, any disparity in single parenthood, all kinds of disparities that you might think, living in a poor area, it would be more dangerous, you're more likely to be a homicide victim. But those kinds of disparities are relatively modest compared to the homicide victimization disparities. Something else is going on here. Okay, and I can point you to literature that tries to understand this. But that's not the case for women. It's particular, the disparity, black-white disparity for women is still large, about 3-to-1. But that is roughly commensurate with single parenthood, poverty rates, and so on and so forth. Whereas for males, it's somehow amplified. The homicide rates go up more substantially as you transition across race for males than as you transition across race for females.
This is per 100,000 population within your own.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Per 100,000 population, otherwise it wouldn't be meaningful. Yeah, exactly right. So per 100,000 population within our own group of celebrities.
Is it possible to even find out like what percentage of this were like blacks killed by blacks or
yes,
whites?
yes, yes,
Whites
absolutely.
by black
Yes,
and-
absolutely. So homicide. So this is something I've done a fair amount of work on with my colleague at Columbia, Brendan O'Flaherty. And if you look at crimes, you know, there's a big field called the economics of crime, and one of our big concerns about this is we can't really understand the economics of crime without looking at the detailed structure of particular crimes. And homicide is different from arson, which is different from rape, which is different from robbery. I'll talk about robbery in just a second. So homicide is a crime which is largely intra-group, right? So whites are largely killed by whites, blacks largely killed by blacks, etc., etc. It's largely intra-group. Rape is also largely intra-group. Robbery is not, I'm going to show you. And then there are groups in which offending, I haven't talked about offending yet, but offending differences in terms of arrest, incarceration, and so on. Here also you get big disparities, but they vary from one crime to the next. So with regard to robbery, which I'll get to in just a second, black offending rates are substantially greater than white offending rates. Whereas for arson, you know, well, it's a very serious crime. Arson is a disproportionately white crime. You know, white arson is some more common than black arson. So understanding crime, you have to delve a little bit deeper into the nature of the crime. This is homicide offending. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I just, out of curiosity, what's happening like between 1970 and 1990? Like, why is there this huge spike in crime or murder?
There's a lot of literature on this. There's a lot of literature on this and a huge number of hypotheses that are thrown out there.
Do you have a favorite one?
One is, yes, I can give you a few. One is somewhat bizarre, more bizarre than others. But one is the crack epidemic. So you know, which in the 70s, basically to the late 80s, you had crack cocaine, very cheap, easily available form of cocaine. That you know, and then you know, turf wars over dealing it, and so on and so forth, desperation about acquiring it, etc., etc. That's one of the things why you had, you know, so it goes hand in hand with a lot of drug violence, gangs, and so on and so forth. But why did it suddenly drop? You know, why did this massive drop? This is one of the big questions in the economics of crime, and there are all kinds of hypotheses about it. You know, some of them are quite simple, which is regard to the demographic structure. The age distribution of the population changed, and generally, you know, crime depends very much on the age distribution. You know, if you've got more younger people in particular cohorts, in combination with other factors, you're going to end up with more crime and so on. Crime is not usually committed by the very young or the very old. You know, this kind of thing. You've got, you know, I'll just throw it out there. It's a controversial hypothesis. In 1973, the Supreme Court in the United States passed a ruling in a case, a very famous case called Roe versus Wade, which legalized, which made abortion limitations unconstitutional in many cases, and some people argue that the number of unwanted children went down very dramatically, and that those were more likely to become involved in crime, etc., etc. So you get all kinds of hypotheses. I'm not endorsing any one of these, but there's a huge literature on this. But there's, you know, it's probably a mix of factors. Offending, again, you get this 7-to-1 ratio, 8-to-1 ratio, black-white. Again, offending has gone down, obviously. If less people are getting killed, less people are killing. This is the rate of offending. And homicide has good data because, you know, you can't hide a homicide, basically, compared to other categories. So really, definitely, offending has gone down. But again, you get this big disparity, which speaks to your question. It's largely an intra-group phenomenon. And so therefore, you know, the racial disparity in offending will go down hand in hand with the racial disparity in victimization. Yeah.
What exactly do you mean by offending? Do you mean arrests or do you mean conviction?
Yeah, so these are homicides that are solved. So basically, exactly. So where you get conviction. So there's noise in this. Unlike victimization, you know, you can get a reliable idea of who's been killed. There's always error rates in offending because you have got arrest, incarceration, and so on and so forth. And you could have mistaken, you know, you could have people who are offenders who are not apprehended, and you could have people who are apprehended who are convicted, who are innocent. So you can get, there's more error in this state. But this is with regard to conviction. Yeah, not accusation. Robbery is very different. So you get basically so this is with perceived race of robber versus race of victim. the largest, this is 2002, the largest category of robbery is, white on white. So there's lots of white robbers out there, right? But, so this is the race of robber. White robber, black victim, practically non-existent. So those white robbers avoid black victims, like the plague. It's fascinating because, you can't explain this by segregation, because segregation, if there was a lot of segregation, then you would have very low black on white robbery and very low white on black robbery. But that's not what you see. You get order of magnitude greater black on white robbery than white on black robbery, for example. Whereas within group, of course, is quite high. So this is very different from homicide patterns. What's driving this, And there's work that I've done on this with Dan O'Flaherty, and a lot of it has to do, actually, some of it at least, has to do with stereotypes, which I won't get a chance to discuss. And if you think about it, if you have negative stereotypes about a particular group with regard to, let's say, proneness to violence, even if they're inaccurate, what that means is that you're going to give up you're asked to give up your money, you'll give up your money or your valuables much more easily if you're fearful of the individual who's confronting you. But think about the incentives that creates. I mean, somebody who's completely non-violent, who could be doing, some other job, basically goes up to somebody and asks for money and they get it, There's nothing to be afraid of, but if the person is fearful, they're not going to provide resistance. The biggest deterrent to somebody who is committing robbery is resistance, right? The likelihood of having a compliance is the strongest incentive for somebody to enter robbery. And in fact, if you look at ethnographies, I don't have time, there's a lot of, this is a very interesting subject in its own right, but if you look at ethnographic evidence on robbers, you get a lot of people who actually are perfectly well aware of the stereotypes. The stereotypes don't actually fit, but they're aware of the stereotypes, and they exploit the stereotypes. And basically they're constantly frustrated because their white victims of black robbers are mostly carrying credit cards and checks which are cancelled, and there's not much money. But they still keep trying to rob them because the compliance is so widespread. And that itself is fed by stereotypes. There are robbers, ethnographic studies where they say, they think I'm Idi Amin or Saddam Hussein or whatever, they just give me the money. So think about how that affects human capital decisions. You're deciding which occupation to go into. You'll generally go into the one which is going to give you the highest return. Other things equal. And stereotypes can affect the returns and so on and so forth. So there's all kinds of things going on that are generating this kind of thing. It's very different from homicide. Heterogeneity in beliefs. Okay, this is something that I find very interesting, and I've been working on also in recent years. Do you believe that Barack Obama was born in the United States of America? If you're, this is heterogeneity in beliefs across political identity. So Democrats say, yes, he's born in America, right? Independents say yes, but Republicans say, no or not sure. Only 42% of them are in this particular survey, and it hasn't changed very much actually. It has gone, in the wrong direction a bit. You have these people who just simply believe he's not. If you ask the question, do you believe that he's a Christian or a Muslim? You get the same kind of disparities, right, with regard to religious identity. Although he has, claimed and attended for several decades Christian churches, he is believed to be a Muslim, for example. And a lot of this is coming, although this is political identity, a lot of this is coming from, is correlated with racial identity and regional identity. So a lot of the people who are answering no or not sure are both southern and white. So it's related to racial and regional identities, and not just political affiliation. Large. I mean, large enough to have. Usually, the margins of error for these kind of surveys will be somewhere between 3 to 5 percentage points. So the number of people I don't know, but it's not an unreliable survey. And there's been multiple surveys which will be exactly the same, so almost exactly. This is something that concerns me a lot. Right? So here's belief heterogeneity about the nature of the world in which we live. Okay? So how serious a problem do you think racial discrimination against blacks is in this country being the United States of America? Very serious, somewhat serious, not too serious, or not at all serious. This is 2008, January 2008. Right? And you get enormous, 56% versus 12% in terms of black versus white respondents. They have very different ideas of the degree of racial discrimination in the country as a whole. And this will correspond to ideas about the general fairness of the system under which one lives. And it can affect collective action, it can affect cooperation with police, it can affect voter turnout, it can affect just general civic participation. So it has all kinds of effects. But there's this persistent belief heterogeneity, and people don't seem to consider the belief heterogeneity as informative. You don't get a situation where whites are saying, oh, 56% of blacks believe that there's a lot of racial discrimination, maybe they know better than me, and I should change my mind. Or you don't get blacks saying, oh, maybe my experience is unusual. You've got all these other people saying there isn't much. Maybe I should. Maybe I'm thinking about a previous generation, and I'm basing my beliefs on my parents or my grandparents' experience. So you don't get this kind of belief revision. You get, some deep economic theoretical issues that arise about this. People don't consider other people's beliefs as informative, which means they're basically not attributing to other people the kind of rationality that they attribute to themselves. And this is a very interesting theoretical phenomenon as well for in the frontiers of research in economics right now. Yeah.
I'm just curious to know if the CNN survey had income data.
Not that I know. Not that I know. But
we just see that it's poor people who say, well, we're straight against it.
yeah, but again, I started off with this map of Manhattan, which suggests that income differences don't explain a whole lot with regard to residential segregation. They in fact don't explain a whole lot with regard to homicide victimization, robbery, belief differences. They really they don't give you that much traction along these dimensions. Right? You might intuitively expect that they do, but they actually don't. So these kind of belief differences cut across income lines. If you want to predict what's causing people to answer in a particular way, political affiliation, regional identity, etc., gives you a better predictive power than income. Okay, so I am basically an applied theorist. So empirically motivated, looking at data, but not doing the empirical work, but trying to model, the world in such a way as to make sense of the data that's around us. Right? So this is the area in which I work, and I wanted to, depending on how much time is available, I think we have, 40 minutes or something? Or?
Yeah.
45. I want to go through some theoretical perspectives on, I won't have time to discuss stereotypes, I won't have time to discuss crime. These are all things. Where is Zainab? Zainab has taken this course actually. So she has been through all this. You can talk to her and we look at theoretically at each of these things that I've presented to you. But I'm going to focus, because we only have a few minutes, on segregation. So, what are the causes and consequences of segregation? And there's 3 papers in particular that I'll discuss to some degree. I'm going to start off with a classic paper by Thomas Schelling. It was republished in part in a book called Micromotives and Microbehavior. And I think that every student of social science should read this. Every student. No matter whether it's economics, sociology, whatever it might be. And this paper is very influential. Everybody should. For 2 reasons. One, it tells us something about the world in which we live that we may not have been able to deduce. It tells us how, decentralized, uncoordinated decisions at the level of individuals generate macro patterns that you could not possibly have deduced just by looking at the rules that people are individually using in order to make decisions. The interaction structure is critical in understanding what generates what we see around us in the world. So that's one lesson from this model. The second lesson is that there's a methodology which has come to be called agent-based computational economics. And this is one of the first ever contributions to it. And even though they are now called agent-based computational models, Schelling actually did this on a chessboard with pennies and diamonds, although he had access to computers. But there are, now you can run these things much more efficiently and quickly and in a much more sophisticated way. But it's a methodology that has been on the edges of the economics profession for a long time now, and is finally making inroads. Now you're finally getting mainstream publications accepting it, and INET is funding some initiatives along these lines. But the methodology itself allows you to do things that standard theoretical approaches in economics have failed to capture. And so, to me, if I get through the Schelling model today, I feel like I've given you something that's worth taking away. And some of you may already be familiar with it. And then, if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about a different paper with Rohini that builds on the Schelling model. The Schelling model is very simple, crude, deep in some ways, but narrow in others. And we tried to extend it in a certain direction. I'll go through that if we have time. And I probably won't have time to look at a paper that's forthcoming now with Sam Bowles and Glenn Lowry called Group Inequality, that again looks at this relationship between inequality and segregation from a different perspective. Okay, let's start with Schelling. So, it's such a simple model that you can see exactly what's going on in a very clear way. So if you grasp this, I think you'll have learned something valuable. So what Schelling asked himself is the following. He says patterns of association in cities or in campuses, or even here within your group, right? You can think about the patterns of association within, it's a fairly large group, maybe 22 or something, graduate students here. You can think about the way in which you have been interacting with each other, right? It's not completely random, right? Although everybody may get to know everybody else. There would have been cliques forming, and there would be people who are, chatting with each other more than, with others and so on, And Schelling was interested in, well, what's driving this, right? But the important thing is that they arise from decentralized, uncoordinated choices. Now, in the case of friendship formations, it has to be bilateral at least, right? You can't go become friends with somebody if they're trying to avoid you, right? But nevertheless, it's decentralized. Somebody, initiates and somebody responds or somebody rejects and so on and so forth, right? So it's decentralized, uncoordinated choices. And the question is, well, so people are going and doing this, and they've got all their different, motives. What's the macro structure that emerges, right? If somebody goes and takes a look and creates the graph that I showed you, the friendship network, or the map of Manhattan, those are macro structures, but they are not structures that a policymaker, the mayor of New York, is not saying, okay, you are going to live here and you are going to live over there, right? It's not planned. It's coming out of, it's bubbling up from individual decentralized choices. And Schelling was interested in understanding the relationship between the micro choices and the macro, what are now called emergent properties at the macro. So, in particular, he wanted to say, look, we observe a lot of segregation, and in fact, it's interesting, he was writing around 1970, actually late 60s, early 70s, and that's the high watermark for segregation in the United States, right? So, it's declined a bit since then. And he said, he wanted to know, we see a huge amount of segregation, but what does that tell us really about individual motives? For example, it could arise because people just want to avoid each other, people of different identity groups just want to live apart. It could arise because one group wants to live apart from the other, and the other doesn't. You could still get patterns of segregation. Or it could arise from something totally different, right? And he was particularly interested in the question of, could it arise even if the groups actually, they wanted to live with each other? Right? Could you get huge segregation, even if people actually don't like segregation? Right? This is one of the questions that he wanted to explore. So to do it, he said, okay, so let's construct a simple model in which there's no discrimination. So anybody can go live wherever they want. Okay? Unrealistic, but but abstraction can be extremely valuable in modeling if you can capture the essence of something and just throw out other irrelevant things, right? Because discrimination is going to give you more segregation. So if you get lots of segregation without discrimination, that tells you something important. So he said, okay, let's forget about discrimination. We know that discrimination can give you segregation. Let's assume it doesn't exist. Then how much segregation would be observed? He says, let's assume no racial income disparity. So if you're black, white, whatever, let's suppose that you have the same amount of income. So you're not going to get segregation as a side effect of income differences, because we've assumed them, we put them out, to one side. But we're going to have decentralized, uncoordinated location decisions. How much segregation are we going to observe? So the way he explored this, and there's a whole bunch of Schelling segregation models, but I'm going to go through the simplest one, simplest, cleanest, clearest one. So imagine two types of households located on a grid. So think about a chessboard. And all they want is that strictly more than 1/3 of their neighbors should belong to their own group. So if you imagine a chessboard, and he used pennies and dimes, right, two types of coins, US currency. If you imagine pennies and dimes, and you associate, think about the pennies wanting at least 1/3 of their neighbors in terms of what's called the Moore neighborhood, up, down, left, right, diagonal. So each person has 8 potential neighbors. Right? Think of a chessboard. Each person on the interior has 8 potential neighbors, up, down, left, right, and then diagonals. And each person would like at least 1/3, not at least, strictly more than 1/3 of these neighbors to be of their own type. Pennies want at least 1/3, more than 1/3 to be pennies, dimes want more than 1/3 to be dimes. Now, if you imagine pennies and dimes laid out in perfect order, penny, dime, penny, dime, penny, dime, right? Have a chessboard like that. Everybody's happy. Nobody wants to move. Because, everybody's going to have 50% of their neighbors of their own type. And 50% is clearly more than 1/3. And so nobody wants to move. So people's demands are consistent with complete integration. The most complete integration you could imagine is viable in the Schelling model. Okay? But here's what he does. He says, okay, let's start with complete integration. Everybody's happy. Okay? Now we're going to perturb the system a little bit. How are we going to do it? Through random removal and partial replacement. So he takes a few of these pennies and dimes, and he takes them off the chessboard. People die, people migrate, people go, do all kinds of things. He just takes them off the chessboard. Now everybody's neighborhood is a little different, because they've lost some neighbors. Right? Now what he does is he has partial replacement. So he will take some of the people he removed, maintaining their identities. Pennies remain pennies, dimes remain dimes. And he puts them back randomly on this chessboard. Not all of them, a few of them. Now, once he has done that, people's neighborhoods have changed again, because new people have come into their neighborhoods. Now you can look and say, oh, are people still happy? Well, obviously not. Obviously there's going to be a few people, maybe 3, 4, 5, that are now unhappy. Okay? Not many, because remember, you started off with a situation where everybody was happy. Okay? Now you took a few people out, put a subset of those back, and now you've got people who are unhappy in a few locations. Fine. Now what do? Now you randomly select one unhappy person, okay? And you find a location, again randomly, where that person would be happy, okay? And you plunk them down over there, and now they're happy, okay? But the consequences of their exit and entry has done something to two neighborhoods. It has changed the racial composition of the neighborhood from which they have departed, which might cause some happy people to become unhappy, or some unhappy people to become happy. And it has changed the characteristics of the neighborhood which they have entered. And that can also have these same two effects. Okay, what do we do next? Now we have a new set of unhappy people, right? Which will not correspond to the set that was unhappy before. Now you pick randomly one from this, and you repeat the process. Repeat and keep repeating until everybody's happy. And then take a look at the macro structure and say, well, what do we got here? Right? Let's go through the example. So here's where you start. So he takes off the corners, right? Because the corners don't have a whole lot of neighbors. And everybody's here is happy, right? You take this x's, let's call them x's and o's. Okay? Take the x over here. X over here has got 4 out of 8 neighbors of their own type, 50%, more than 1/3, no problem. Okay? Take the corners. So this x over here has 2 out of 4. That's also 50%, no problem. Yeah.
Actually, one clarification. In the beginning, the assumption was that there is no racial discrimination.
No racial discrimination meaning, okay. So, okay.
The conflict, what I'm saying that in the game or in the plan, there was a demand that at least 1/3 should be of the neighbor should be of your own group.
Good. So let's think a moment about what we mean by racial discrimination. Okay? Now, one of the most interesting and insightful distinctions, taxonomy if you like, or classification of racial discrimination by Glenn Lowry is the following. He talks about 3 types of racial discrimination. Discrimination in contract, right? Contractual relationships, and discrimination in contact. Okay? Discrimination in contract would be labor market discrimination. I don't hire you because you're black or Latino. Or I don't let you live in this neighborhood because you belong to this particular group. Or I don't lend to you. I don't give you a loan, bank loan, because of your religion. That is discrimination in contract, in market discrimination. After the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, this is illegal in the United States. Okay? Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It happens. But it is formally, technically illegal. And it is judged by most people also to be unethical and immoral. People ought to be judged, as Martin Luther King said, on the content of their character. Right? But only in contractual relations. Right? There's also discrimination in contact. Who should I become a friend with? Who should I date, marry, adopt? These kind of interactions. Racial discrimination is not only permitted, it is constitutionally protected. If people discriminate, they say, for example, think about gender. Right? People in general will marry people of the opposite sex. Not always, but in general. And that, nobody argues that that kind of discrimination is unacceptable. In fact, it would be considered to be unconstitutional under US law to force somebody to treat males and females as marriage partners equally. Right? But similar things apply with regard to racial identity, religion, and so on. There are many people who would like to marry people of the same religion. Now, you can ask yourself, both in terms of ethics and all, about, whether this kind of right is good or bad, whether it should be protected or permitted, etc., etc. So there's no doubt that this kind of discrimination is widespread. And in fact, no society in the world, no relatively free democratic society in the world tries to regulate these kind of interactions. So when I say no racial discrimination in the Schelling model, I'm talking about no discrimination in contract. You can live where you want, you can get your bank loan for your mortgage, you can get hired, but discrimination with regard to, I don't like my neighborhood because it has too many people who are not like me, that kind of discrimination is permitted in the Shelling model. In fact, it is at the heart of the Shelling model. And it's at the heart of social interactions everywhere. Okay.
So it's not a very demanding criteria to have less than, to have one above a third. Or is that?
Yeah, it's not very demanding. You can play with that. You can change that if you like. It's not very demanding because each group is willing to accept minority status. If everybody, anybody who has 40% of the neighbors of their own type is living in a neighborhood where they're a minority, and they're going to be happy in the Shelling model. So that's worth keeping in mind. It's not that people want to be in the majority. If everybody wants to be in the majority, you're going to have difficulties keeping people happy. But they're willing to accept minority status, but not too much minority status.
Would it hold with more than 2 groups?
So let's before we ask would it hold, let's figure out what the it is, right?
Yeah, sorry. What I meant to say is that the perfect the uniform distribution or
So-
the mixed equilibrium, that the mixed situation with no segregation.
Well, if you had
is
multiple
equilibrium.
groups, so for example, this has been done with 4 groups, right? In the United States, where people have elicited preferences and so on and so forth. People have done a lot of work on this. With 4 groups, you'll have to have preferences over each group type. Which group, how do you feel about group A, B, C, etc. And qualitative, the flavor of the results that I'm going to present to you from Shelling survives under those conditions. People can have relatively tolerant preferences about the neighborhood racial composition. And you could still get things that you will get under the Shelling model. But let's come back to that question after we know what Shelling gives us, right? What the model gives us. So here everybody's happy. Yeah.
Sorry. So we now take this as kind of one point. You can, for example, see this population as being 50-50, say 50% white, 50% black.
Yeah.
And let's say that one particular group doesn't mind living with a large chunk of another type of group.
Yeah.
You would get a particular type of immigration from one certain group, completely upsetting the balance. Has more work been done on this?
Yes. In fact, more work was done by Shelling in this. In this between what he called the self-forming neighborhood model, which I'm going to present to you, and the bounded neighborhood model, which is what you're describing. The bounded neighborhood basically thinks of a city or an area, a village, you said. 20 people removed and replaced 5. So I think you have 15 empty spots now. So 20 people have been randomly removed and randomly replaced. 5 of those have been randomly replaced in empty slots without consideration of whether they would be happy there or not. Okay? Okay, keep that in mind. What's the right hand figure? No. Huh? Unhappy people. The right hand figure tells you, the left hand figure is what you get once you have removed 20 and replaced 5, and the right hand tells you unhappy people. So why is this person unhappy? This person is here. They've got only one of their own type compared to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 20%, which is less than 1/3. Right? So they are unhappy. And if you check in each of these, you'll see that they're unhappy. Everybody else is happy. Right? Which is not surprising because in the beginning everybody was happy. Right? So only a few people now are unhappy, and these are the few people who are unhappy. So now what Shelling does is he picks one of these at random, right? And now he does not put them down randomly. So for example, suppose that he picked this person over here. This person has only 1 out of 3. So this person is already on the borderline. Right? 1 out of 3 is 1/3. They're just barely unhappy. But you could pick any of the others, pick any of them. And now what he does is he looks at all the empty spaces. And out of all the empty spaces, he asks which would be acceptable to the person I had lifted. Okay? And then he puts them down in a place that is acceptable to them, chosen at random, among the places that would be acceptable. Right? So he does not put them down in a place where they would be unhappy. They're not going from unhappy to unhappy. They're going from unhappy to happy. Right? So you would think that if you pick up unhappy people and you put them where they would be happy, you would think that the number of unhappy people in the society would tend to go down. Okay? But it doesn't. It doesn't because somebody, so this person here, wait, let's find this person here. So this person gets up and leaves. What they're doing is, in effect, changing. So if this person gets up and leaves, this person who was happy before now ends up with only 2 out of 5. So they'll still be happy. But you can see the point. The point is that you're changing the neighborhood you leave and you're changing the neighborhood you enter, and so different people can become unhappy. Okay, so what happens at the end of this process? Now here, if you look at the left-hand figure, which is figure 5 in his book chapter, this is the situation you reach if you start off, if you apply this process and repeat it until everybody's happy. You know, you pick up and move, and you keep doing this until everybody's happy. The number of people who are unhappy might go up before they start to go down. But eventually, you're going to reach a situation in which everybody's okay. The left-hand side tells you one position at which this process could end. And you can see this is why it's called the self-forming neighborhood model. You can see that you get patterns of segregation. So you get, you get these sort of, you can even draw lines actually. And you can see that there are clusters. You've got a cluster of X's, here another one, and then you've got various clusters of one large, slightly dispersed clusters of O's. So this is an end result of the Schelling process. What's the right-hand side? It's a different end result. Remember, there's randomness here, right? You've taken people up, pick people up, put them down. There's also randomness in where you're putting them and picking them up from. So every time you do this, you're going to end up in a different situation. These are two different end results. But what Schelling claims is, yeah, they're different, but they're not that different. If you apply segregation measures to these two, you will get rough equality in segregation measures. They're roughly equally segregated. The difference is in the details. The difference is not in the macro properties of what you're ending up with. But the key point is that no matter how many times you do this, you do it millions of times if you like, but you will never end up in a situation that looks like this, with a few holes in the middle. Right? You will never end up, even though you know that such a situation would be stable if you could reach it. You just don't ever reach it. Now, somebody could come in here and actually pick up people, individual by individual, and arrange them in a very integrated pattern and make sure that everybody's happy. That could be done. But then you perturb the system again, and again it's going to collapse into this segregation. So the basic point he made is that the decentralized uncoordinated choices that are driving people's behavior are going to drive you towards a situation that nobody necessarily wants. Right? You can do the Schelling model where people actually prefer integrated neighborhoods. They don't like segregated neighborhoods. And yet, it becomes an outcome of this process, even though integration is perfectly viable. And we know it's viable because of the assumptions of the model. Yeah?
So if you just said like, if there are X, or A X's and B Y's and C places, what are the total number of arrangements that satisfy this as a fraction of the whole? Would you just, and look at that distribution, do you just find that the reason this is true is that there just aren't that many that actually satisfied it, even though it might seem that there would be?
Very good. That's quite a mathematically deep question, actually. What he's saying is that, and your intuition is kind of right, but not quite in ways that I'll get to. So here are two possible endpoints of this process which are stable in the sense that everybody's happy. Now what you're saying, can you tell me your name?
Jonathan?
Jonathan, what Jonathan is saying is, look, these are just two, right? It's obvious that they're going to be more than two. In fact, there will be thousands or tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands or millions of different ways of arranging people across space such that they'll all be happy. That could be the end point of the Schelling process. Some of them will be integrated, we know that. And his conjecture, Jonathan's conjecture is, maybe the ones that are integrated are very few compared to the total that could possibly arise. He's taking a sort of, for those who have got a bit of a science background, he's taking a sort of entropy approach to this problem. Basically saying, look, yeah, you can have integration, but it's so unlikely that you're going to end up with segregation because segregated allocations dominate the set of stable allocations. Now that may be true, it may not be true, but it's not relevant. What's really going on, right? And the reason it's not relevant is because it is entirely possible for integration to be a very small in the set of total allocations, and yet you can have systems in which you go towards that integration. So what's really going on? You're very close, but not quite. What's really going on is that the set of states from which you go to integration is itself small. So if you think of these as equilibrium states, where everybody's happy and nobody wants to move, and you think of this left-hand figure as a disequilibrium state, where a bunch of people are unhappy and would like to move, you can ask the following question. For every equilibrium state, and there's a lot of them, as you said, how many disequilibrium states exist such that you can reach that equilibrium state? from that set of disequilibrium states. That's referred to as the basin of attraction. So I'm getting into a bit of a technical literature now, but the basin of attraction of the equilibrium state. So for each equilibrium state, you could say, okay, how large is the basin of attraction? How large is the set of disequilibrium states from which you can reach that equilibrium state? And that's the thing that matters, not how many integrated equilibrium states you have relative to segregated equilibrium states, but how large are the basins of attraction of the integrated states relative to the basins of attraction of the segregated states. And the modern expressions of Schelling's results says the following, that integrated states, there may be few or there may be plentiful, but they have small basins of attraction. There are very few. You have to be pretty close to being integrated to reach an integrated state. If you start off with people all spread out and segregated, the chances of reaching an integrated state starting from that point are practically zero. So your intuition is very good and very correct, but what matters is not how many integrated equilibrium states you have relative to segregated equilibrium states. What matters is how large are the basins of attraction of one set of states relative to the other. So that's a bit of a digression, but it's a very good question. It's a very good question worth thinking about. Yeah.
So what is the population size for the two groups?
So in this case, the initial population size is equal, but then since you remove 20 at random and replace 5, that process of removal and replacement itself introduces some asymmetry in population size. So ex ante, looking from the beginning, the population sizes are equal. But 15 of these people are going to go off to some other place and disappear forever. When you initially remove 20 and put 5 back, and that will give you asymmetry in population sizes. So you can count from these slides, you can count them. It's not going to be much different from 50%, but it could be slightly different.
So I have sort of follow-up conjecture.
Yeah.
So is it the case that, so call the fraction of my neighbors that I like alpha or something like that, and then plot kind of the fraction of like convergent states to that go to the segregated solution, like plot that with alpha. I would expect that for 0, obviously it's going to be 0, and then I would expect that it would increase very rapidly, kind of close to a certain, there's kind of like a critical threshold of my fraction of neighbors. And
you mean my demand? You want to your alpha is the 1/3. Is that what you mean by alpha?
Yeah. So if you vary the 1/3, for instance, so at 0 you would have everyone, all states are just going to converge to anything, right? Everyone's happy always.
Yeah.
And then there's some kind of critical threshold where that stuff's increasing very rapidly, the fraction of states where you're going to converge, disequilibrium states where you're going to converge to segregated equilibria.
That's exactly right.
And so where about is that cutoff, I guess?
For this particular specification, 8x8 chessboard specification, I'm not sure where exactly that cutoff is, but you can find the cutoff yourself for any arbitrary size of population by going to a website at Northwestern, and they have programs written in NetLogo, and you can actually specify your alpha. You can say how tolerant do I want people to be, and you can simulate it, and within a fraction of a second, you'll see the endpoint. And you can actually see exactly, you can try to, by trial and error, try to find that particular threshold. But you're exactly right. In this literature, this kind of discontinuity between the parameter, in this case a preference parameter, and the outcome, in this case the level of segregation, it's not strictly discontinuous, but there's a very, very sharp change at some particular point in time. It's referred to in the agent-based computational literature as a phase transition. And it's somewhat like the freezing of water. You lower the temperature and water just becomes cold water, and colder water, and cold water, and then suddenly it becomes ice. That's the kind of thing he has in mind. Where the structure changes in a way that appears to be discontinuous. And that's absolutely right. These models generate this kind of thing. And standard economics models that you will look at in your textbooks just don't have this property. This is also why I think it's useful to study this. Financial crisis. You have no financial crisis. Lots of things are happening in the economy. And bank balance sheets are going up and going down, and suddenly you get something where you get a run on the shadow banking system, and the whole thing is falling to pieces.
Institutional changes.
Yeah, institutional changes, revolutions. These are all can be viewed as phase transitions. Some of the most interesting sociological phenomena can be viewed as phase transitions. and he's right. In the Schelling model, there's a phase transition. If you're very tolerant, everybody's always happy, you know, you're never going to get segregation. But is there a critical point where suddenly everything changes? And that's profitable. Yeah, very good. So here's how Schelling summarizes what he finds. So we're going to 10:30, right? And
we can go to 10:35. We start a little later.
Yeah, but is that accurate? That
yes.
Yeah. Okay. So here's how Schelling summarizes his findings. He says people who have to choose between polarized extremes. So look over here. These are endpoints of the Schelling process. And if you think about somebody here, you know, think about somebody here who's thinking about moving, right? They're in a completely segregated neighborhood. There's no diversity at all in the neighborhood. If they're thinking about moving, you know, what are the choices they have really? They could move here, but then there'll be a tiny minority, right? Or they could move, you know, you can think about all the different places that they could move to. But basically the places that they could move to are one of two types. There are places where there would be an overwhelming majority of their own type, or there would be a tiny minority of their own type. And basically the endpoints of the Schelling process have that quality. So basically what Schelling says is that people who have to choose between polarized extremes will often choose in a way that reinforces that polarization. I can either be a tiny minority or I can be an overwhelming majority in my neighborhood. Well, although I would like to have a nice mixed neighborhood, the tiny minority is not acceptable to me. So let me go to a neighborhood where I'm an overwhelming majority. But that just reinforces the polarization and it makes available to others the exact same choice. Do you want to be a tiny minority or an extreme majority? If a whole bunch of people could simultaneously coordinate, you know, and form an integrated neighborhood, they might all be much happier as a result of it. But it's very difficult to achieve this through decentralized, uncoordinated choice. That's his point. Okay? And then here's the deeper point. So people who have to choose between polarized extremes will often choose in a way that reinforces the polarization. Doing so is no evidence that they prefer segregation. Only that if segregation exists and if they have to choose between exclusive association, people elect like rather than unlike environments. So basically he's saying, look, I have a choice between a neighborhood in which 1% of people are like me or 99% are like me. They're both extremely segregated neighborhoods. I go to the one where 99% are like me. I would much prefer somewhere between 40 and 60, but there's no 40 and 60 around. And if you go and look around, you know, we can go back right here. You know, the left-hand side is the real Manhattan. You're choosing between polarized extremes. And if your choice is between polarized extremes, you're going to choose in a way that reinforces the polarization. Right? It doesn't mean that a whole bunch of people here wouldn't be happiest if one could, you know, create and sustain an integrated neighborhood, right? But it's not going to survive. That's the Schelling effect. You perturb it slightly, some people move in, some people move out, and boom, you know, we've lost it. Okay, let me just give you a sense of how robust this insight is. Okay. So this is the work. You have to. Huh? You have to. Yeah, I'm just gonna talk about the basic insight in a very informal way without going through the models for these other two papers. So the paper with Romani basically says, well, look, Schelling's model is limited. We're not the first to make this point, of course, but you know, Schelling's model is limited because you don't have income differences, right? And what happens if people's attributes are multidimensional? In Schelling, everybody's exactly the same. You're a penny or a dime, right? It's only one dimension of difference. Well, what if you have multidimensional attributes? You know, you have two different groups, and you've got, you know, people care about both their identity and their income. And you've got income differences between groups. And suppose that, you know, sorting is based on income and race. So basically, you want to live in a high income area, but you also have Schelling type preferences. And Schelling type preferences we assume are of the following type. Basically, if your own group population share can be between 0 and 1, you don't like everybody to be like you, and you don't like everybody to be unlike you. You know, basically, you like mixtures, right? And even in this case, you reproduce the Schelling results very easily. Okay? As long as you dislike this kind of extreme less than you dislike this kind of extreme, right? As long as you'd rather be an overwhelming majority than in a tiny minority.
Yeah. Just a clarification: is it possible for everyone to achieve something equivalent with this if you have a population of so let's say 80% white, 20% black, which is it possible to have a range such that
Yeah, the population, the global populations matter, right? They matter. For example, if one group is very small in the population, there's no way that people can have access to them, right? So even if everybody wants a 50% neighborhood, but one group is only 5% of the population, it's impossible. You can have a few 50% neighborhoods, but then the rest of the neighborhoods are going to be all 100% the majority group, right? So that the overall population constrains the degree of integration that could result. That's absolutely right. And we look at these kind of issues in this paper. What happens as you vary the size of the minority group? Let me give you the basic insights from here. So we assume that people care about both income and the income of the neighbors and the racial identity of the neighbors, but they don't like extremes. Right? They like mixtures. In addition, people like private consumption. I mean, neighborhoods that are in Schelling, every neighborhood has the same rent, 0. You can move wherever you want. There's no such thing as more desirable or less desirable neighborhoods. There's no such thing as more expensive or less expensive neighborhoods. So what we try to do is to bring in prices. Again, we're not the first, but we bring in prices and we bring in preferences that are a bit more complicated. You care about the income of your neighbors, you care about the racial composition of your neighborhood, and you care about the rents. And desirable neighborhoods will have higher rents, and that will keep people out. But there's no discrimination, again, as before, in the sense that if you're willing to pay the rent, you can get housing. You're not blocked from living in a particular area. Now, so there's no restrictions on location. So let me just give you a summary of what we find over here. What we find is that, so then we can look at equilibria, in the same way as Schelling did, we can look at equilibria of this process. So what we find is the following. I'm not going to go through the, so I'll just go through an example. So here's an example. This is closer to the kind of bounded neighborhood, the village idea that you had in mind. So right, people care about the entire neighborhood, not individual neighbors as in Schelling's chessboard model. So here's a city, think of a city or a village or whatever, 45% black, 55% white. And the income distributions are different. So remember, one of the things we're trying to do is to allow for income heterogeneity within and between groups. So you have an income distribution between 0 and 0.7 for the poorer group, which also happens to be the minority group. And then you have between 0.3 and 1 is the income distribution, uniformly distributed, for the more affluent group, which is also the majority group. Okay? Now, this is not a stable allocation. So this is what you would get if you had pure sorting by income. If you had pure sorting by income, that means that over 52%, if your income is bigger than 52% of the maximum income is 1. Right? So the folks who are rich will live together, and the folks who are poor will live together. So this is pure sorting by income. This is not an equilibrium of the model that Rohini and I are considering. But let's just take it as a benchmark. Any such allocation, any such division of people across neighborhoods is going to generate two things. One, a racial composition. So beta is the proportion who are black in this neighborhood. Okay? Think of this as a city and this two neighborhoods. So the proportion black here are 66% because you've got the people who are below this level income, they are more black than white who are below that income. So this neighborhood ends up being 66% black and this neighborhood only 24% black. Okay? Now mu1, mu2 are the mean income levels. The mean income level here is 0.31. Remember, you're aggregating across all these income levels here plus all the income levels here. 31%, 0.31 is the average income in the poorer neighborhood, and 0.72 is the average income in the richer neighborhood. Now, this is not going to be an equilibrium. People are not going to be happy, and they're going to be people who are moving. Right? Let me show you what an equilibrium looks like. So here's an example. Here's an example of what an equilibrium looks like. An equilibrium here, you have got the entire population here plus a small sliver of the population here living in this neighborhood, which is now, instead of 66%, 90% black. And so the racial composition of the two neighborhoods are as far apart as they could be. Here you've got 90% black, here you've got 0%. Okay? The income differences are actually less than they were under pure sorting by income. Instead of 3172, you now have 3568. So the income difference across neighborhoods is actually less. Why is it less? Because now you've got some of the more affluent blacks living here. Right? Because for them to move over here, if they were to move into this neighborhood, they'd be too small a minority. And even though they prefer to live in a neighborhood which is richer, and they could afford to do so, because remember, you have got some quite poor whites living in this neighborhood. So the richer blacks could move here if they wanted to. But if they move here, they'll be so small a proportion of the population that they'd rather stay in the poorer neighborhood. Right? Even though they don't particularly like this racial composition either, right? Under the preference assumptions we have made. So this is one example of inequilibrium. And the key point, here's the key point that we emphasize in our paper, is that if you look at equilibria of this model, where people are sorting based on income as well as racial composition, and where rents are adjusting to clear the market in each neighborhood, you get something that looks like this. You get this kind of situation. This is exactly the equilibrium that I described to you before. But you can ask the following question. You can say, let's look at people who lie between 0.36 and 7. People whose incomes are between 0.36 and 7. So people who are below 0.36, they all live in the poor neighborhood. Okay? People who are above 0.7, they all live in the richer neighborhood. But what about people who are between 0.36 and 7 in income? Okay? What's happening is that the people who are between 0.36 and 7 but belong to the group that has the lower income distribution live in the poorer neighborhood. Whereas if they have exactly the same income level, 0.36 to 7, but belong to the more affluent group, they live in the more affluent neighborhood. And one of the points we made is that stable equilibria in this model have this property. What does this property imply? This property implies, think of somebody who's got income level 0.5. Somebody who's got income level 0.5 and happens to be black is going to be living in a neighborhood where their neighbors on average have income level 0.35. Their neighbors are poorer than them. Okay? But if they have the exact same 0.5 but are white in this equilibrium, they're going to be living in this neighborhood and their average neighbors are 0.68, which is richer than them. So even though you've got two people who are identical with the exception of them belonging to different groups, their neighbors are not identical. Right? The people who belong to the poorer group, holding constant their own individual income level, are living with people who are poorer if they also belong to the poorer group. Now this has some intergenerational implications. So, a lot of work is done using data, individual level data on people in the United States. Family characteristics, individual characteristics, test scores, and all this data is used to predict the performance, life performance in terms of your earnings, educational attainment, and so on, of children. But for a variety of reasons, this data doesn't contain detailed characteristics of the neighbors with whom you associate, both socially and in terms of residential choice. But here you have a situation where two people are absolutely identical, both with 0.5 income, but they have very different income characteristics as a result of the fact that they belong to groups that have different characteristics. It's not that they are different as individuals. They're different in terms of the group membership, and as a consequence of the fact that people are shelling light into neighborhoods based on racial composition, they end up with neighbors with very different characteristics. Now, this is not just a theoretical abstraction. Let me just show you, and I'll stop in a minute. Let me just show you something about Manhattan. The same time and place, 2000 Manhattan. So here's white, non-Hispanic, right, people, and there are 16 income categories, and I showed you these income categories on the map. If your income is less than 10,000, which is the poorest, the lowest income category, you can ask, in Manhattan, if your income is less than 10,000, what is the average income of your neighbors? The average income in your census block group? Well, your average income is much more than yours. It's 60,000. Okay? It's 60,000 because, like I said, there's a fair amount of income mixing in Manhattan. So the folks who are earning, let's say, 8,000, 9,000 a year and are non-Hispanic white, their neighbors are on average much richer than they are. Okay? Now, what happens as you yourself become richer? As your income is larger? Well, as your income is larger, as you go down this column, you can say, well, what happens to the income of my neighbors? And that goes up, and that's not surprising. So basically, richer people live in neighborhoods which are richer, and so therefore have richer neighbors. So that's all this is saying. Richer individuals have richer neighbors. If you look at the top, $200,000 or more annual income, their neighbors are quite rich, 147,000, all right, 148.